You didn't need it anyway, my father said, his voice disturbingly casual through the phone, as though he hadn't just admitted to stealing my entire college fund. Besides, what's done is done. No point getting upset over it now. My name is Vanessa, and at 25, I stood in my tiny London apartment, clutching my phone as my father explained why the money meant to pay for my final year of college was gone. That account, the one I had spent years building with scholarships, part-time jobs, and every penny I could save since high school, wiped out by the one person who was supposed to protect my future. How much is left? I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my hands were trembling. Left? He actually laughed. Honey, there's nothing left. I had a few debts I needed to clear up. But you're smart, you'll figure something out. Figure something out. As if I had a choice. As if my father hadn't just stolen 4 years of hard work from right under me, while I was studying abroad, powerless to stop him, because the account still had his name on it, a relic of opening it together when I was 17. I see, I said softly. Well, good luck with your debts. That's my girl, he said cheerfully, mistaking my calm for acceptance. Always so practical, just like your old man. Anyway, I've got to run, meeting some friends for drinks. We'll catch up soon. Drinks, with my money. The money I spent nights working instead of sleeping, summers spent indoors instead of travelling, all to make sure my tuition would be covered. I sank into the chair by my window, staring down at the cobbled London street I'd come to love during my semester abroad. 3 months left until I was supposed to return home. 3 months to figure out how to salvage my education after my own father had kicked out the foundation from under me. My phone buzzed again, a text this time. Don't mention this to your mom or grandma. No need to stress them out. Of course. Just like he hadn't told them about his gambling debts. Just like he hadn't told them about the failed businesses, the string of loans, the unpaid tabs, all the damage he left behind wherever he went, always shielded by charm and excuses. I opened my laptop and started making a list, the only thing that gave me any sense of control. Gather documentation, bank statements, transaction records, screenshots of the deposits I made and the scholarships I'd won. Research options, emergency financial aid, student loans, part-time jobs, anything that might keep me afloat. Legal advice? Could I even pursue anything if his name was still on the account? My father had always underestimated me. In his eyes, I was decoration, his backup plan, the responsible daughter who could pick up the slack when things fell apart. Good thing you're pretty, he'd say when I brought home awards. If college doesn't work out, you can always marry well. I hadn't worked this hard, built this much, to let him burn it all down. He thought I was being practical when I didn't scream or cry. He had no idea that practicality was exactly what he should be afraid of. Over the next week, I pieced together just how thoroughly he'd betrayed me. The account had held just over $42,000, money I'd earned from scholarships, tutoring gigs, retail jobs, and careful budgeting. He hadn't taken it all at once. No, that would have triggered alerts. Instead, he had siphoned it off in small, steady withdrawals over several months, just low enough to stay under the radar. My roommate, Emma, found me sitting on the floor, bank statements spread around me like puzzle pieces. "Your dad did what?" she said, horrified, scanning the documents. "Can you report him for theft?" "Legally, no," I said. "The account was in both our names. He had every right to access it." I swallowed hard. I just never thought he actually would. I should have known better. After all, this wasn't the first time. Birthday money that borrowed itself when I was a kid. Promises to pay me back whenever the next big deal came through, convincing me to apply for extra loans in my name because it'll build your credit. My phone kept buzzing with texts from him. No apologies, no remorse. Just more deflection and unwanted advice. Don't stress so much, honey. Maybe this is a sign you should take a break from school. I know some guys who could get you modelling work, pays better than any degree. Every message was a reminder of how little he valued me. My work ethic, my ambition, they were obstacles to him. My independence threatened the convenient narrative where I existed to support and admire him. I started making calls to the university's financial aid office, legal clinics, even my grandmother. I didn't tell her everything yet, just that I was running into some funding trouble. I knew once she learned the truth, she'd set the world on fire. The next call from my father came while I was in class. "Hey, princess, quick question. You wouldn't happen to have any other savings accounts, would you? You've always been so good with money." I wanted to scream, but I kept my voice even. "Why do you ask?" "No reason. Just thinking about your future, that's all. You know how dads worry." Thinking about my future, the same way he had when he emptied my college fund. The same way he had when he tried to talk me out of studying abroad because family comes first. "Sorry, Dad. In class. Got to go." I hung up and immediately opened my laptop, adding another item to my list. Close any other accounts he might know about. Move everything to a new bank. That evening, an email arrived from my grandmother. "Called your dad today. Asked about your college fund. He seemed nervous. Is everything okay?" I smiled despite everything, imagining the panic in his voice. My father feared very few people, but my grandmother was at the top of that short list. "Can we talk?" I wrote back. "There's something you should know." Her response came almost instantly, a video call request. I took a deep breath and answered. The screen filled with her familiar stern expression, flanked by my mother and aunt, who must have been visiting. "Tell us everything," she said. So I did. I showed them the transactions, the texts, and the cavalier way he'd dismissed my entire future as collateral damage for his poor decisions. My mother's hand shook as she read his messages. "I had no idea," she whispered. "He told me you were taking a break from school, that you were homesick and thinking about moving back." Of course he had. My father had always been a gifted storyteller, reframing facts to suit his needs, making his failures sound noble and my achievements sound accidental. "I've documented everything," I told them, "every withdrawal, every excuse. Every time he's tried to guilt me into silence, I'm not letting him get away with it." My aunt, a lawyer, leaned forward. "He had legal access, so a straight theft charge won't stick. But," she said, "there's leverage here. Did he ever put anything in writing? Promises to repay you?" I pulled up the emails where he'd called it Vanessa's college fund, and the texts where he joked about paying me back someday. "Perfect," my aunt said, her smile sharp. "Not a smoking gun, but enough to make him sweat." "So, what happens now?" my mother asked. "Now," my grandmother said, her voice steel, "we make sure Greg learns exactly who he's stolen from." Of course, he had. My father had always been a master of rewriting reality to suit his needs. How many times had he taken my achievements and twisted them into proof of his own parenting genius? How often had he casually stolen credit for the very things I had worked so hard to accomplish, while quietly undercutting me when it served his interests? "I've documented everything," I told them, my mother, my grandmother, my aunt. Every withdrawal, every text, every smug phone call. I'm not letting him walk away from this. My Aunt Sarah, a lawyer with a reputation for taking no prisoners, leaned in. "Legally, it's messy since he was still on the account. But if he ever acknowledged that the money was yours, If he ever said it was for your education, we might have leverage. I pulled up my folder of screenshots, emails where he'd referred to it as Vanessa's college fund, texts where he'd joked about paying me back when one of his big deals finally landed. Sarah smiled, sharp and satisfied. Perfect. Not enough for a slam dunk case, but plenty to make him squirm. So, what happens now? My mother asked, her voice quiet, still processing the full scope of what her husband had done to her daughter. My grandmother straightened her back, her chin lifted. Now, she said, with the kind of steel only decades of disappointment can forge. We make Greg understand exactly who he's betrayed and who he's underestimated. The plan came together quickly. My grandmother would confront him first, no warning, no chance for him to twist the story. Sarah would draft a formal demand letter, laying out every dollar he owed and the consequences if he refused to make things right. And my mother, finally after years of excuses, would start the divorce process she'd been putting off for too long. He's always underestimated you, my grandmother said that night as we prepared. Treated you like you were just an extension of him. It's time he learns who you really are. That evening my phone rang, my father sounding just a little too cheerful. Hey kiddo, weird thing. Your grandma seemed a bit upset today. You didn't say anything to her, did you? I didn't hesitate. About what, Dad? About how you emptied my college fund to pay off your gambling debts? About how you decided my future was disposable? Or about how you think my entire education is worth less than your bar tab? The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Then came the pathetic attempt at charm. Now, princess? Don't call me princess. My voice was cold. Don't call me at all. From now on, everything goes through Aunt Sarah. Sarah? His voice sharpened with panic. Why would your aunt need to be involved? Because she's a lawyer, Dad, and you're about to need one. His reaction was almost predictable, a tantrum in 3 acts. First came denial, loud and self-righteous, then anger, furious texts accusing me of betrayal. Finally, the inevitable slide into desperate manipulation. You're blowing this out of proportion, he texted. It was just money. Family is more important than money. I didn't reply. I forwarded each message directly to Sarah, letting him write his own case file. The next morning, he showed up at my grandmother's house uninvited, his smile firmly in place. He never made it past the front porch. How dare you, my grandmother said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Stealing your own daughter's future. You disgust me. Mother, please, he tried, his voice all fake, hurt. This is a private family matter. Exactly, she said. And you betrayed your family. Now leave before I call the police. He left, but the texts didn't stop. They got nastier. Your grandmother's brainwashing you. I'm your father. You owe me respect after everything I've done for you. I thought back to everything he'd done for me, like trying to talk me out of applying for scholarships because smart girls intimidate men, or borrowing my childhood savings to fund his latest can't-fail investment. He'd done plenty for me, all right. The next blow landed 2 days later when Sarah's demand letter arrived at his house. It was precise and unflinching, itemizing every withdrawal, every broken promise, every dollar he owed. Attached was a firm deadline for either full repayment or legal action. He called within the hour, outrage sputtering through the phone. You can't sue your own father, he shouted. Watch me, I said, and hung up. The fallout spread fast. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years reached out, horrified by what they'd learned. His sister, my Aunt Patricia, called to say she wasn't surprised. He borrowed money from my kids' birthday accounts once, she said. Always promised he'd pay it back. Never did. He's been like this since we were kids. takes what he wants, counts on the rest of us to forgive him because family sticks together. Well, not anymore. It was my mother who finally filed for divorce. The financial betrayal was just the final straw in a marriage built on uneven ground. During the first hearing, my stolen college fund became part of the official record. "You drained your daughter's college savings?" the judge asked, barely masking his disgust. "I was going to pay it back," my father mumbled. "With what income?" the judge pressed. "According to these documents, you haven't held stable employment in over 3 years." The carefully maintained mask of the fun-loving, generous family man was slipping, and beneath it, everyone could see the truth. The university's financial aid office, to my surprise, turned out to be incredibly supportive. Once they understood the situation, they fast-tracked emergency aid, helped me secure additional grants, and worked out a payment plan for my final year. My grandmother insisted on covering whatever gaps remained, even though I hated the idea of taking her money. "Unlike your father," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I believe in investing in things that matter, and you, Vanessa, matter." My father's response to Sarah's letter was to plead poverty, claiming he had no means to repay me. That lasted exactly until Sarah uncovered his new car purchase, his vacation photos on Facebook, and the country club membership he'd managed to keep. "He's not broke," Sarah said with grim satisfaction. "He's just hiding it, but not well enough." His texts grew more erratic. "You're ruining my life. My own daughter turning against me like this, after everything I've done for you." The facade was crumbling, revealing not the misunderstood father he liked to play, but the manipulator who had always seen me, my achievements, my hard work, my future, as nothing more than his safety net. The final break came when he tried to turn my younger cousins against me, painting me as the villain trying to ruin him out of spite. It backfired spectacularly when my cousins forwarded me every word. "Remember when Uncle Greg said he was looking after our college funds?" my cousin Jake wrote. "Guess we know how that turned out." With Sarah's help, they locked down their own accounts before he could touch them. His carefully cultivated family man image was collapsing, one burned bridge at a time. "He's always counted on family loyalty to shield him," Sarah said. "It's time we show him that loyalty goes both ways." He was finally learning the truth. The daughter he always underestimated, the daughter he treated like a backup plan, was the one who was going to hold him accountable. And I was just getting started. During my mother's divorce proceedings, more layers of my father's deception began to unravel. Bank statements and credit reports exposed a pattern. He had been hiding assets, taking out loans in her name, and even attempting to remortgage the family home without her knowledge. "He's been treating this family like his personal ATM," my mother said, stunned, "and we all just kept making excuses for him." My grandmother, always the family's moral compass, called another family meeting, this time with one rule: my father wasn't invited. One by one, relatives shared their own stories. Unpaid loans, broken promises, sudden disappearances when debts came due. The picture they painted was clear. This wasn't just my story, it was a pattern. A lifetime of exploitation hiding under the mask of charm and family loyalty. "He's always counted on that loyalty to protect him," my Aunt Sarah observed. "It's time we show him loyalty works both ways." The consequences hit him like dominoes, one after another. First, my mother's divorce attorney uncovered enough hidden assets to secure a settlement far larger than he'd anticipated. Then Sarah's legal pressure forced him into a formal repayment plan for the money he stole from me, complete with interest. His carefully curated persona, the generous, fun-loving dad, collapsed entirely when word spread that he'd been targeting elderly relatives, convincing them to invest in schemes that never existed. He's been running his own little Ponzi scheme, Sarah muttered, adding those new discoveries to her already thick file. His texts shifted tone. Anger gave way to desperation. I'm still your father. Families work things out. Everyone makes mistakes. What will people think of you, treating your own dad like this? I thought about all the times he'd used guilt to control me, twisting my love and sense of duty into a tool he could wield. Not anymore. Through my grandmother's network, I found a flexible part-time job that let me finish my degree while working. My professors, after hearing my situation, gave me some breathing room and adjusted deadlines when I needed it. Every small victory felt like another inch of space between me and his influence. What surprised me most was the wave of support from my extended family. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, sharing their own stories of his manipulation, small loans never repaid, favours always turning into long-term obligations. Aunts and uncles who used to defend him now stood firmly against him, embarrassed they'd ever trusted him at all. Your father called me today, my grandmother told me one evening. He asked me to talk you into dropping the repayment plan, said you're tearing the family apart. I didn't even have to ask what she said. I told him the only person who tore this family apart was the man who stole his own daughter's future. His last real act of defiance came at my graduation. I hadn't invited him, of course, but there he was, standing at the back of the hall, loudly introducing himself to anyone who would listen. That's my girl up there, he boomed. Gets her business sense from me. My Aunt Sarah had security escort him out before the ceremony even began. Later, she gave me a hug and said, "Your success belongs to you." He doesn't get to rewrite this story. A year after I first confronted him, his world had completely collapsed. The divorce proceedings laid bare the trail of financial destruction he'd left behind. Friends who had once trusted him with investments now demanded repayment. Elderly relatives filed formal complaints. The family network that had shielded him for decades turned its back, tired of being used. My graduation party, hosted by my grandmother, was more than just a celebration of my degree. It was a celebration of my freedom from him, from the weight of his manipulation, from the fear that I owed him my loyalty simply because of biology. Friends, cousins, even old teachers showed up to support me. Many shared their own stories of breaking free from toxic parents. Your dad called me yesterday, my mother said quietly during the party. He wanted me to convince you to cancel the repayment plan, said he's learned his lesson. Has he? I asked, thinking about his latest Facebook posts. Photos from a business retreat in Mexico. Luxury meals. Still living like someone who'd learned nothing. My mother sighed. He's learned he can't manipulate you anymore. That's not the same as learning a lesson. Sarah's repayment plan was ironclad, monthly installments deducted directly from his paycheck. No excuses, no delays. When his schemes dried up and no one would lend him money, he was forced into something he'd avoided for most of his life, a real job. It's not fair, he wrote in his final email to me. I'm your father. You're supposed to love me no matter what. Love isn't a blank check, I replied, and trust comes with conditions. That was the last time I spoke to him directly. My career in London took off faster than I had dared hope. My degree, and the fight to protect it, became a story of resilience I was never ashamed to tell in interviews. Every promotion felt like another layer of armour. Every professional success a shield against the man who tried to turn my potential into his personal safety net. My grandmother became my fiercest advocate, her loyalty a stark contrast to my father's self-serving version of the word. "He called me again," she said over dinner one Sunday. "Wanted to know if you got that job in London, said he might visit." "To visit or to ask for money?" I asked. "Both," she said with a smile. "I told him you're done funding his lifestyle." The family dynamics had shifted permanently. Relatives who once defended him now exchanged warnings about his latest cons. Aunt Patricia even set up a group chat to track his attempts to manipulate younger family members. "He tried to talk my son into co-signing a car loan," she reported once. "Told him it was a great way to build a credit. Sound familiar?" It did. He'd tried the same thing with me at 18, only my grandmother had intercepted the paperwork. Back then, I didn't understand what predatory looked like when it came from family. Now, I knew better. Watching his world shrink as mine expanded didn't feel like victory. It felt like validation. Every monthly repayment, every blocked scheme, every time he was held accountable was proof. He could do the right thing if he was forced to. He just never thought he'd have to. My success became my greatest form of protection. The degree he'd tried to destroy now hung proudly in my London flat. Every promotion a reminder that his failure to break me was his greatest miscalculation. His attempts at reconciliation grew more desperate. First came the birthday card, the first in years, signed, "Love, Dad, your biggest supporter." Then the Facebook posts tagging me in old photos, rewriting history to paint himself as the supportive father who sacrificed everything for my education. Sarah helped me draft a cease and desist letter when he started telling family friends he had helped get me my job. "He's trying to rewrite the ending," she said. "Make sure you control the story." His schemes continued, but fewer people fell for them. Relatives contacted me directly when he tried to sell them on investments or job opportunities, each time ending with, "Is this real?" And each time I set the record straight. My grandmother finally visited me in London, her first trip abroad at 70. Seeing her pride as she stood in my flat, surrounded by everything I had built on my own terms, felt like closing the final chapter of the story. "You know what makes me proudest?" she said, holding my hand across the dinner table at my favourite pub. "Not just what you've achieved, but how you never let him turn you bitter. You just got stronger." That evening, my phone buzzed with another text from him. "Heard your grandmother's visiting. Flat must be cramped. I can recommend some nice hotels." I showed her the message and we both burst out laughing. Same old tactics, now so transparent they were almost pathetic. "Should I reply?" I asked. My grandmother raised her glass. "Darling, your success is the only reply he'll ever need."